We're absolutely delighted to welcome you. I'm Anna Penfold. I'll be joined from the Russell Reynolds team by my colleague Brad Pugh. Brad and I are both members of the global HR practice here at Russell Reynolds. We spend all of our time focusing on the HR leadership community. Some of this is in the area of executive search, but we also support people and organisations with broader talent and leadership. And as part of the work that we do, we help HR leaders successfully transition and grow into new roles. And on this note, thinking about the slightly unnerving statistic that some 40% of leaders fail within their first 18 months of a new role, we wanted to investigate further and to help support the HR community, hence bringing this panel together. It's our absolute privilege to facilitate the conversation today. We've invited a stellar group of CHROs to discuss the topic of how we, as HR leaders, can actively plan our successful transition into new roles. Brad, over to you.
So we're delighted to be joined by 5 global HR leaders from across different industries, different parts of the world, public companies, private company, and they've all kindly offered their time in this conversation today to help develop the HR community, but they are also kind enough to contribute to the thought piece that we put out just a few months ago on advice for transitioning in your role. So let me quickly introduce the group and we'll jump into a conversation. Ernest Marshall is joining us. Ernest is the CHRO of Eaton, which is an $18 billion, almost 100,000 employee New York Stock Exchange traded company that does power management from electrical products to aerospace, vehicles, etc. Ernest was previously at GE for 21 years, and he was most recently the head of aviation, head of HR for the aviation business. Kathryn is the CHRO, Kathryn Pritchard is the CHRO of Nord Anglia Education, came in just over a year ago, and it's the largest operator of private schools globally. So 67,000 students are being educated through their schools. Private company. Previously, she was the Chief People Officer and Strategic Programs Officer at Odeon, the cinemas group. And before that, she was at BT, Iris, Aegis Media, and began her career teaching before moving into HR at BBC. Erik is with us. Erik's the CHRO at Pandora, the Denmark-based jewelry company. They have about 28,000 employees, $3 billion in revenue, sells products through 3,000 stores. Erik was previously the CHRO at Britax and has been an HR leader at HSBC, Avis, the rental car business, GE, Lego, and Diageo. Erik, you pretty much cover most of our shopping lists and bank accounts as we go to the next season of our life here. Tina St. Ledger is the CHRO at GW Pharmaceuticals, NASDAQ listed company, UK based, pharmacy products that cover everything from epilepsy to autism, about a $500 million business with a beautiful $4 billion market cap and about 1,000 employees. Previously at GSK, where she was the head of HR for Europe and the therapeutics group, and then before GSK at Marks and Spencer. So thanks for being with us as well. Then lastly, Trui Hebbelinck is at LivaNova Group, joined March 2019, so a little over a year ago. It's a $1 billion publicly traded NASDAQ company, makes medical devices, think heart, lung machines, heart valves. Gosh, thank you for the products you're creating in this challenging time this year. And her career spans 20 years in healthcare, financial services, energy. She was at GE and at Shell previously. So thanks for being with us. And with that, Anna, do you want to kick us off maybe with our first question for the group?
Absolutely. Welcome, everyone. So my first question, Kathryn, actually. So before and during your first days in the role, how did you engage with the board and the CEO at Nord Anglia?
Oh, that's a good one, Anna. So I don't think there's any kind of miraculous answer to that. I mean, how do you engage with any group of people that you're trying to get to know, really? I suppose the most important thing for me was to really understand their priorities, because at the end of the day, they're going to understand the business dynamics and the commercial dynamics much better than you can as a newcomer. So whatever you think you know, whatever I thought I knew I was bringing to the role, and everything I'd done before, I kind of held that quite lightly and let them lead me. So I was just very straightforward about asking them what it was they wanted me to deliver. And for me, actually, it was some very kind of basic things around recruitment. We recruit a lot of teachers that have to be recruited in a very, very short time window, and we have to move our principals around the world in a very short time window, and those things had to be done. So rather than kind of get very sophisticated about what I thought the agenda would be, or what I wanted to show that I could do, and all of that kind of stuff that a bit of anxiety kind of brings about, I let them lead me, really, and they gave me a very clear steer about what they wanted, and then I kind of got on and let the work kind of do the talking, and that seemed to work quite well, because once the work gets underway, I found that you start to learn the things about the business that nobody can tell you, because they're just so tacit, but the work kind of flushes it out, and then just gradually kind of got into the role and understood what good looked like for them, and that was it, really. So not a particularly miraculous kind of set of advice points, really.
When we were talking before for the insight piece, Kathryn, you talked about working with your chair, particularly on some major talent issues. So I know there was maybe that was part of your plan, but it was absolutely a sort of serendipitous moment. Is that something maybe you'd advise others to try and find a good window of opportunity, particularly with the board?
Yeah, so we had, so I think it was probably about 8 weeks after I joined, we got a new chair, and our chair is an ex-CHRO. So the chair of our board is Sandy Ogg, who was the CHRO of Unilever, so probably known to quite a few people on the call. And as an incoming CHRO, it's kind of like, oh right, okay, we've got another CHRO coming in as well. So I mean, for me, that was really excellent, because he started talking about the talent agenda and the leadership agenda. He's really passionate about both. So he started talking about that quite early, and he's got some methodology that is really brilliant, actually. If anybody doesn't know it, it's well worth looking at. And so that was really great, because the board was instantly engaged in all of that work, and got a dialogue going really, really quickly. So maybe I got lucky there. I think I probably did, but that got me going with the board quite quickly, which was useful. But the CEO needs to be very involved with that as well. So you can't, you've got to keep board and CEO, informed, and everybody moving in step, really. So that's a bit of work.
We always observe that people will say it's hard to measure your success as a CHRO. That could be 4 years in. It sometimes can be hard to really quantify success. Ernest, looking at, now that you've been in the role for 2 years, as you think back to those early months, maybe 6-month mark, how did you evaluate your success at that point?
Yeah, great question. And Brad, Anna, thanks for doing this. I really appreciate it, and glad to be a part of this esteemed group. So, a few points. You only get to be new once. Everyone wants to be a part of your assimilation process. They really do, because they feel like it's an opportunity. If they feel like something needs to change, then they can be a part of that change. And I think the third thing is you have to understand the baseline. And so what I always do going in with a healthy level of anxiety, because I think it keeps you motivated, is what's the baseline? Just asking the questions, clean sheet of paper. If you could change something in the culture, what would it be? What's working? You don't always have to reinvent things that are working. What are the priorities you see for the business? How would those translate into HR priorities? So I really start with that kind of baseline, and I keep track of those. And so you go about the business of of doing the work and some of the things Kathryn already spoke about that all of us, I'm sure, have had to undertake. But really what happens is you need to have a gauge to kind of measure your progress. And what I always do is I try to wait at least at a minimum 6 months, because what does that give me? That gives me 2 board meetings. I also ask the CEO to talk to the board members who are particularly on the committees that I'm a part of, so the comp committee and the governance committee, and say, hey, what are they seeing? What do they think? What were their, and I get their initial priorities as well. But what I do in the 6-month period is, there people do 360s and other things. I actually want a live person to go in, because, I want someone that they can converse with, someone that's neutral, that has credibility. And so I have them literally sit down and do interviews with my peers on the leadership team, my HR team. And then I ask the CEO to go back to the board and revisit the questions that we discussed, when I started. And I found, Brad, that process to be really exhilarating, quite frankly, because, you're trying to understand the rhythm of the organization. And, you hope to do things that appeal to the broader audience, but, you find that those relationships you build and the things you focus on, they really happen one contract at a time. There's really, there's some things you can do that kind of help the organization. And I'll give you a quick example. That was something where you start, how you ask yourself, how do you really know? I was going through the budget process that, is never fun, and particularly in this environment. And I was making a joke with one of the leaders in the finance organization. And I said, I may not be here next year with all this I'm trying to do, jokingly. And she said, no, you're going to be here. She says, I've recognized some changes in the culture just since you've been here. And that's gratifying to know that you're making an impact. You're kind of tracking it yourself. And I really, when I got those results back after 6 months, it wasn't all good. Let's be honest. There were some things that some of it was stylistic, some of it was misperceptions. And I think you have to go back, and I do go back, and I go back and talk to those people with their permission to just kind of clarify it. And so that's kind of, something I've used before this worked for me.
And tactically, did you bring an external party in, or did you have somebody from your L&D group do that?
Yeah, I did. I've done both, but in this in particular, I had someone inside, because it had been very clear early on that she had the credibility, and people would be honest with her, and she would be honest with me. It was very, and she was. And so I in this instance, I did it with an internal person.
Good.
Trui, one for you. In the situations where there's a predecessor, such as when you joined LivaNova, there wasn't a CHRO, but there was someone who had a sort of CAO type role incorporating HR, and their legacy obviously is a part of is an aspect of your transition. How have you respected the past whilst building your own future and the future for LivaNova?
Thank you, Anna, and hello everyone. So great question, and great stories already shared. So what I'll try to do is just telling my little story, so that hopefully that gives you some ideas and inspiration of making yours. So when I came in LivaNova, the journey started well before starting, I would say. It starts with that first contact, and it was indeed my predecessor, David, who was more than 15 years with the company, had helped to grow this company, and who was a CAO, who was done, which was a general counsel, and with a bit of HR and IT at the side. So it was part of the attraction of the job, really, to be able to establish HR from the start. But having said that, there was an established HR team who were pretty much, used to doing things in a certain way. So if you're ever in that situation, that is a luxury, to have a predecessor, one who is really looking forward to attract somebody to take over from him, but at the same time is happy to let go. So my personal stories, I love history, I love stories, who doesn't? But I'm also a psychologist. Speaking with the CEO is very clear what he wanted to see do. He wanted to see a very clear talent strategy going forward, and an HR strategy for the future of this company, which wasn't there. So I knew that strategy needed to be built. Where do you start? And so the word was used, I pummeled the previous CAO with questions. It was said, I think, during the run-up. So maybe a little bit to my detriment, I absolutely amended that later on. But I really, with an eye towards the outcome, I was, thinking, what are the questions I really need to ask? And he got very comfortable, and not only him, but many other people, very happy to tell stories. The things I found out, I often still think back to as to this day, because the history of how things are coming together. This company was a merger of two different worlds, not even companies, who was held together by two very separate structures. We didn't speak to each other, and there was still an us and them and a silo mentality. And going back to understanding where people were coming from really helped to identify the strategy, but also how you then get to the success and going forward. So it's an absolute luxury to have somebody like that. And secondly, there was psychology in play as well. While he was very receptive to hand over, he was retiring, and there was the psychology of stepping back and allowing somebody else to take over, which was not always easy. So treading that very carefully, with respect to him, with respect to the team around it, paid dividends. But that was, so great start actually from that perspective.
We talked a little bit about setting priorities. It's been a theme that's been touched on. Tina, how did you identify your priorities when you onboarded, your goals, and with whom?
Yeah, thanks. And thanks for inviting me to be here as well. So actually, there were some real similarities with what I heard Trui saying just now. Really, a lot of questions. I mean, the sort of pummeling with questions. I love that expression, because I sometimes felt I was doing that a little bit. There was a lot of pre-stuff as well. So I think I felt, and I now understand, never be sort of worried about asking too many questions beforehand and getting lots of spending time, with presentations and briefings and anything you can get hold of beforehand. Any data beforehand as well helps as well to start to shape your understanding of the organization and therefore the priorities. And I did have a mentor actually about a year beforehand. And as I was thinking about my first CHRO role, and I remember her saying to me two things. One was, write everything down. Don't stop asking questions at the beginning, and write everything down, because what you notice on day 1 might be different to day 10 and then to day 72 and so on and so forth. And I sort of wrote everything down, and I'd notice certain things coming up time and time again. I asked obvious questions like, what do you want the HR priorities to be? But not only of the senior team and the CEO, but also every single site that I went to, when I spoke to people in manufacturing who were sort of working on manufacturing lines, different countries, roles, levels of seniority, etc. Kept on asking those questions. So, and I think that helped shape quite clearly. I did have a bit of a remit coming in as well, which in some ways was kind of obvious. And a lot of that was around kind of globalizing the HR function. And there were some other rather obvious things like, I also had sort of had predecessors, but I was the first CHRO. So there were 2 people who did kind of regional HR roles, and they were still there. So I did work hard to make sure that I got built a good relationship with them, and also understood what they felt the priorities ought to be, because this idea, I think, of honoring the past and what's been, and understanding the present, and then trying to determine priorities going forward, all comes together. You need to sort of meld it all together and honor the past. And data just helped, because I think there's stuff that people tell you, very, very important, of course, but actually looking at the data to see what that is telling you. Everything from, obvious things like engagement surveys, but any other, you often find there's all these sort of informal surveys that have taken place, annual reports or proxy statements, anything like that that gives you data about things like, remuneration of the executive team and the officers. That becomes a very important thing. Get very close to your comp specialist or your comp director or senior director, because you need them. Like, you need to know you've got a good one. And a lot of the priorities are, I found in this role, have been very compensation, remuneration related as well. So I think just bringing that all together. I joined at a really smart time, actually. So I would also advise joining like July was kind of good. I don't know why, it just happened to be. It was halfway through the year. So I was able to sort of complete some things that definitely had to get done, but I joined the budget planning and objective setting cycle at quite a nice time as well. So I was a little bit informed and was able to start building that. And then just the cadence of the year, the new year, just kind of worked well. So I identified things that sort of took me through to the end of the year, low hanging fruit, quick wins, get some credibility in quickly.
Interestingly, 4 out of the 5 of you joined your companies in July. So there must be some magic to starting your job in July.
And the upshot is, don't try and join just before Christmas, maybe. That probably is a bit too much. Erik, in hearing the story about you joining Pandora, you talked about one of the learnings being feeling almost as if you were on stage, very visible, and being listened to in a very acute way in your new role. What can you share about that part of the new CHRO role that you moved into there?
Thank you, Anna. Hello, everybody. And yeah, I joined August 12th, so I don't know if that's close enough to July, but maybe. You're right, Anna. The kind of one of my big takeaways from the Pandora journey has been profile. And let me tell you a little bit about the context, because I think that helps explain why this was more of an issue than I possibly expected it to be. And Pandora, when I joined last year, was in the middle of its turnaround. So the business performance was heading the wrong way. The CEO was on the way in. The chairman was on the way out. There was a lot of change at the top of the organization. And we'd embarked on a 2-year turnaround program, which hadn't really got traction yet. And in the midst of all that, the CEO says to the organization, I'm going to restructure the top team. One of the first roles we're going to hire is a chief people officer. Now that was quite a shock to the organization, because the function had a very different reputation in Pandora. And in its 20-year history, it had never had that role on the top team. So I think people were naturally curious about, oh, why now? What's different? What's this animal going to look like? What should we expect of them? And I'll never forget, I think it was on my first day going up in the lift to my office, and somebody said to me, oh, you're Erik. You're here to write the people plan. And I thought, crikey, it's my first day. I've not even got to the office yet. And somebody seems to know very clearly what my agenda is all about. But that was kind of quite fortuitous, if you like, or foretold, if you like, what was going to happen. And I think I was quite shocked by, how often there were requests for come join meetings, come be part of this. We want to, somebody in my second week invited me and said, come and share your game plan. And I'm thinking, crikey, given the state of the business, writing long-term game plans was about as far from being a priority as you could imagine. But there was this kind of constant kind of feeling of curiosity, maybe scrutiny, which I had to manage. And I felt, crikey, I need to tool up a little bit here. I need to sharpen the saw. I spent time with a good network contact of mine around, how do you present, how do you show up? Because I wanted to make sure that if that was a key issue, that I was turning up with the right mindset and the right approach. And of course, how you show up is important. So yeah, it was unsurprising. Maybe with retrospect, with hindsight, it maybe shouldn't have been, but at the time, it was definitely surprising.
Would you even recommend sort of going through the media training type mindset? Do you think, Erik, if you were to go through that, knowing what was coming up again?
I would, I don't know about that, but I would definitely get people who are making the transition into the number one role. I mean, there's 26,000 people in our business. It's a fully vertically integrated business. Design, manufacture, retail, marketing. It's a very people-led business. And I think the elevation, I probably underestimated, and the benchmark for the function, I probably underestimated. Things moved fast, as you know, and so I was there quite quickly. Research time was limited, and so I'm quite envious of people, my peers on the call, who had time to ask lots of questions I did all that once I was on board and reacted really.
Tina, you know, we've touched on relationships, and our experience has been that CEO CHRO relationship is really what can make it work incredibly well, and it's usually one of the things that makes it not go particularly well. What advice would you have for the group on how do you build that CEO CHRO relationship and even the executive team in the early days? Any specific tactics or advice that you have for us there?
You know, I think you said it as in your question almost, but it's so obvious but so critical to choose your boss when you're even going for the job to begin with. And I would just say that if you have any concern, if you would ever have any concerns whatsoever about where they would, you know, position HR, or you've heard something about the way that I don't know, their value set and yours, and that might not match, or just really anything, I think really thinking about you know, your role as choosing your boss as much as it is him or her selecting you. I think that's just so critical. But once you're there, on the more practical things. So my boss, the CEO, is based in the US and I'm in London. It's California, so it's an 8-hour time difference. So we don't even overlap very much in the day if I'm going to have, or he's going to have any kind of normal working day life at all. So yes, it was always going to be a challenge. I spent my second and third week in the role there. So some very practical things like full immersion, you know, so 2 weeks there, actually working with him beforehand to plan out and, you know, just very openly express that this might be a challenging thing to do was really important in the sort of joining, the onboarding. And so we thought together very hard about how to do this. We had an offsite in my second week, so my first week in California, with just the executive team that he had set up. So again, you know, I was kind of lucky. I chose well in having a very engaged boss in that way. So that was for us all to sort of work together again. July, good timing. Strategy planning was starting at that stage, so that was good. And then the second week happened to be an extended leadership team offsite or something. So it worked beautifully. But I think immersion was a really big thing, and just investing that time, both upfront beforehand and then in those first couple of weeks, and just being physically close together. Another sort of important thing, but practical again, was we have offices. Not all places have offices. I hadn't for about 12 years. It was open plan at my old company. But anyway, we have offices for some of the senior folk. And so my office was in London, and I didn't have an office in the California building, let's say. But a predecessor who was in a sort of slightly different role had the sort of office next to the CEO, like literally like alongside. And sort of I was here sort of almost like hopping around trying to find somewhere to work, like I was the visitor. I thought that could happen, and I'd been there before I'd started. So I don't insist on very many things at all. I'm not a very sort of insistent person in that sort of hierarchical way, or I really am not. But I did insist on having my own place to sit, so that it wasn't like I was always a visitor there, but just sort of symbolically I was part of sort of established people having a place to sit. I mean, anyone could use my office whenever they liked. I didn't bother about that, but I had to have a place that was as if it's mine there all the time. And again, that was very important. And then finally, actually, in about my third month, I brought my family over, and they had a holiday there. Again, that was a little bit part of, you know, I wouldn't always do that all the time, but it was just part of them. So from a family perspective, them understanding where I was all the time. And then, again, my CEO kind of met all of them. They met the team, other members of the senior team. And that it just felt like it built a familiarity also. I think just one final thing I'd say is my boss has been the CEO since the company began, so 21 years ago. And so that also, the nature of that relationship, I thought was going to be very important, that it was trusted, but I mean, let me say it very basically. I needed to not kind of diss the past in any way in things I observed or noticed. It was very much about honoring the past, appreciating it, but also building the trust so that we could work together to either make changes or, you know, be open to challenge about what had been and what perhaps could be different. And I had to, and for that, I didn't go in too fast or hard on that one. And that was just, that was sort of an intuition really, just around his style and my style. I'm a bit of a bull in a china shop, I must admit. I'm a bit sort of, I just go for it. But I really had to think about that carefully, given the character and the history and etc. So that was particular to this situation.
So interesting. And it's very opposite, actually, particularly thinking about how we can't travel now. So Ernest, just thinking about approaching, you know, if you were to start the role now in a COVID period where you can't travel, how would you recommend approaching the CHRO role? How might you do it differently?
Well, interestingly enough, I think for all of us, because we're still so new, we all started in COVID, really. I mean, it's, you know, none of us will assimilate completely in a year or 15 months. So it's been something we've all been thinking about. And ironically, for us at Eaton, you know, we just hired a new CFO, a new chief technology officer, and a GC all during this period. And while, you know, I'd love to tell you we were thinking about this, we had put together a more formalistic onboarding plan, because when I arrived, I kind of got a sheet of paper and they said, hey, go for it. And, you know, it was something that was important for me to say, when we bring people into the organization, how do we help them? I mean, how do we give them a leg up as much as we can in the onboarding process? And the word I would use, I'd say you have to be incredibly intentional when you're trying to onboard, irrespective of a COVID environment. COVID is just, you know, I think COVID is actually going to make us better even when we return to some sense of normalcy. I told my team the other day, I said, we should always think about onboarding in a COVID period, because you have to be much more intentional. And so what we do when we bring new people on, and you know, what I did for myself is, for their first kind of week, we have them loaded up. You know, we have the calls already set. We have both individual and groups. We make sure that we coach the person around. Look, when it's easier in person, but when you're on these Zoom calls, how do you inject fun and laughter into the conversation? You know, I always think of comedy as just a funny way of being serious. And so I think it helps the conversation. And we really do try to be intentional with how we connect people. And then what we try to do on the other side, from an HR perspective with my team, is go back and ask people, say, how'd you feel? How was that experience? You know, what would you do differently if you could change it? Just because, you know, we're trying to get the dialogue going. We're always trying to improve the process. And, you know, I'll tell you, to a person, the folks that we brought in have been very complimentary around how we've kind of set them up and get them established. Now, think about it. We're in 75 countries. And so you've got time zones, you've got languages, you've got people who have most of their team, you know, just like Tina, who are in different parts of the world. And so they've got to figure out a way to connect. And so we try to bridge that gap for the first, you know, 30 days, and we help them with their 30, 60, 90-day plan. And we do we call it a new manager simulation up front. You know, we've learned now how to do those virtually. And then we kind of do what we call a reunion assimilation about a year out, just to make sure that we're connected as well. And so it's, you know, I'd love to tell you we figured it out. We haven't. It's been challenging, but as much as we can and as intentional as we can be in trying to connect people together through the use of technology, I think is what we're trying to do. And look, it's, you know, as human beings, we are built to be connected to some extent. And so I think it's important that as much as we can, we bring that sense of informality in, because that's what you miss when you're not sitting in the office next to people. You just can't go and kind of have that informal dialogue. And so we tell people on your chat function, set something up. I said, if something's on your mind, say, hey, I need to go ask Anna something, just click it to her, because that's informal for them. And that goes, oh yeah, that's a good idea. You know, what do you think about this? You know, so I do it with my team. I just text her, hey, what do you think about this? So it's like, it's coffee talk electronically. And so that's what we try to accomplish. So that's kind of what we're doing. You know, again, if I'm always asking for insight and feedback if someone's doing something better, because I'll steal shamelessly if there's a good idea out there.
Still with pride, absolutely.
Still with pride.
I love that idea about, you know, forever onwards thinking about people joining as if in a sort of pandemic period, because it, you know, it forces you to think differently, doesn't it?
Yeah, it absolutely does.
Really interesting.
Trui, you joined, I think you shared with us that you joined with a stock dip early in your tenure, and you mentioned I think a similar mentality of we're not going to waste a good crisis. How have you leveraged crisis and maybe that crisis for a positive opportunity?
Oh, Brad, that's such a great question. And I don't know about my colleagues, but you really only know what's really going on, what company you joined and the people you work with until you've gone through some form of crisis. Anything before and after is generally, you know, too much steady state to learn enough from it. So I'm happy to talk a little bit through that. So yeah, I think literally it was a couple of weeks in, and it went all great and smoothly until market crashed as a result of a very disappointing and important part of our business, which I won't name, but it was in a specific region, and I happened to have been there, which wasn't a region where I normally was based. So, and before I dive into, I think it's really about always be ready for a good crisis, never waste a good crisis, and always figure out or have a plan in mind to figure out quickly what your role could be, where you can add most value. So the first one really took me by surprise, not expected, and presenting itself in a very strange way. Similar individual conversations with people, a member of that region, telling stories, things that really didn't add up and that were very, very concerning. Where do you take that from here? Well, my predecessor was still around, just double checking, validating what I heard. And have you heard these things before? Where shall we start? And quite quickly, and a long story short, leadership exchanged, didn't take ownership. People were incredibly fearful for a long historical train of reasons. And we found a positive way into that region in a very different way as we did before. And with some help of external consultants, we were able to actually reanalyze where we were with our products and our markets and reshape that market completely. It took, you will be surprised, I never thought it would take that long to really settle something so deeply rooted. It took a year before we really saw the green sprouts of it, of the change decisions we had taken before people really bought into it. And it took a number of change of leaders as well, deeper in the organization and on the top. But ultimately, I'm so pleased that it happened. And we wouldn't be the company we are, we wouldn't be the business we are if it hadn't happened. A second story, Brad, if I may, and I'm sure all my colleagues are in the same boat, is obviously the pandemic. It just happened to be that I'm a child of two big blue chips, GE on the one hand, Shell on the other hand. One of the things I learned doing in Shell was dealing with crises. You get trained, you have certificates in how to deal with oil spill, even if you're an HR person. You get trained on how to deal with Greenpeace in front of your office, which happened in the period I was there in Shell for a week or three. They just camp out and you can't get in and out of the building. And you get trained, how to set it up and how to manage this training. So, and I would strongly recommend to everyone, if you haven't got the basic skills, it's fantastic training how to deal with a crisis. And HR is always in the middle of this because people are impacted. And it occurred to me that I've referred to the silo mentality before, two different worlds coming together, and that was visible. So people responsible for sites or operations or plans, they felt responsible for their bits, but they never felt responsible for other colleagues outside their functions. So we had started the concept of the idea of site leaders before. And on the basis of some very basic principles, we started having that concept and saying, you might be responsible for operations, but you're actually accountable for everyone who works on your site and for external issues, internal engagement issues. And so it happened 3 months later, pandemic hit, and how do you get connected globally? All of a sudden, back to what Ernest mentioned, you are so much more virtual. And so you're forced to need that representation on sites globally. And so until today, I hold, initially we held it weekly, but I held now, every other week, site leader calls, which is, a group of 40 people across the globe to help us on a couple of principles: health and safety of our employees, who's infected, how are the operations going, how's supply chain doing, and how are the commercial signs going, and what else, what other help is needed. As a result, we were able to basically fivefold the amount of policies and help we were able to do, all the way up to kind of rolling out flu vaccines, or helping with distance measures from one plant to another. And it really made us a completely different company. All of a sudden, we're not talking anymore about they and them, or London and the US, or Asia. We all know and can actually share best practices. So, well, it's probably an exaggeration, but I do love crises. They're the best thing you can have.
Kathryn, slightly different tack, which is thinking about ownership structures and the fact that Nord Anglia has some private equity backing, and I know that's been a theme in your past as well. And a number of the people on the call and the panel have had private equity exposure. How did you approach your joining Nord Anglia differently, given the very complex dynamics of multiple schools, different ownership structure, as you talked about, principals, teachers, very, very complicated sets of stakeholders within the organisation?
Well, one of the reasons that I was really drawn to Nord Anglia was because it's private equity backed and it's a teaching organisation. And if you think about the kind of values and drivers of those two groups of people, you probably couldn't have more difference and more complexity. And actually that has proved to be really interesting in the 18 months I've been here. So I was quite, and Odeon, when I joined, was private equity backed. So I had a little bit of private equity experience. I don't think it radically changed the way that I thought about approaching the job. I was just very, very curious about how those different dynamics would play out. But I don't think it changed it as I came into the role. But I think as I sort of started to think about how I was moving into it, I probably did start to notice a few things. And, I thought I was being really patient, and was taking things kind of really slowly and listening quite a lot. But I think inevitably, when you move into a role, you're leaving a job that you really understand and you're up to speed with, and you've been probably pretty successful at. So I was leaving a job and an organisation that I knew really well and I could orchestrate fairly quickly, and then suddenly you're in a world where you don't know it as well. You just can't operate as quickly or feel as competent. And I think if I look back on my first sort of 3 months, I definitely would do even less. I thought I was doing not very much and listening a lot and all of that kind of thing, but I think I still was quite impatient. And I think some of that was born out of, moving from being in established and really competent, and then suddenly you're back at the beginning of the learning curve again, and you feel a little bit frustrated. It's a bit of a cliche, but I think I would do even less than I did, and just be even slower. And Andrew, my boss, kept saying to me, there's no rush, but it wasn't him and the organisation that was creating the rush. It was me, So it's a cliche, but I think I would do even less. And the only other thing that was different for me when I joined Nord Anglia was, as Brad said, I used to be a teacher, and so for the first time in a really long time, I had the ability to draw on that kind of operational experience and kind of just say to people, I do understand, and when I taught, it was a bit like that as well. And that's actually been a real pleasure and a real treat to be able to draw on some stuff that I'd left behind 20 years ago. So I guess whatever it is in your kit bag that might be useful, just bring it to the fore and just use whatever's going to be handy, I think. And for me, it was something that I never thought I'd use again, really, but has proved to be really useful. So, yeah.
Erik, one of the questions probably on the group's mind is, if they're not already in a CHRO role, they're thinking about what will that CHRO role be for me. what advice do you have for people thinking about what that ideal role is for them? Because you've sat in a number of CHRO roles now, and you have the benefit of retrospect. What advice would you have to those on the call, or people who are looking at their next CHRO roles, to think about what they might value and how do they pick the right role?
It's a great question. I mean, I guess when I think about the run up to the role, the preparation, if you like, there's probably two big things that stand out for me. One is make sure you've built the breadth in your experience, because you're going to need it. I mean, I look back on my 25 years in a variety of different companies, and my goodness, there isn't an element from all of them that I haven't used in these CHRO roles, and kind of, people expect you to kind of know, it's not like, give me a month and I'll come back and give you a consider, you kind of need to have that at your fingertips. And if you don't have it at your fingertips, you have a very well developed network of people around you, trusted advisors, specialists, whatever, colleagues, peers, where you can just go soundboard and say, hey, is this something you can help me out with? Because it is a very broad role, and that's another one of my key observations. I think for the role people pick, I mean, I don't think there's any substitute to the old maxim around, pick your boss, right? You've got, and I think, Tina, you mentioned something similar. You've got to be super comfortable with who you're going to be working for. And I full stop. It's kind of, you've got to connect on a human level, on a personal level. You've got to have a similar ambition level for where you're going to take the company. Stylistically, I think, there needs to be some contrast, but you also want some similarities. So the CEO I've worked for twice now, we both love big transformation projects. If you don't like big transformation projects, don't work for this guy. It's just not going to work. Now, of course, that worked very well. That's why he was hired into the CEO job. I've done a number of transformations, M&A deals, other things over my career. So this is right up my street. It's interesting, Tina, listening to your story about a CEO who's been in role for 20 years, where you have to tread carefully. And I think that's quite right. For me, it was the complete opposite. There were no sacred cows. Nothing was untouchable, and everything was up for question, because the business was tanking. Our share price was I think back at the beginning about 250 kroner. It's now 650. So we had to do things quickly and dramatically. So I think that's a huge part of what you need to think about. And I do always think in my own head about what I call steady state roles and transformational roles. And I think it applies to us as HR leaders as well. Some people like the kind of red meat for breakfast, and some don't. And I think that's okay. It's both are very important. Both are needed. Know which you are, and know which kind of organization to join.
The last thing I guess I'll bring up, we've touched on COVID and the health pandemic. I mean, but there's the other huge element that we've navigated this year has been social unrest, and here in the U.S. has been George Floyd's murder, and how that has changed the dialogue within society and certainly in corporate America. Ernest, if I could turn to you, I'd be curious, how has what we have experienced here in the U.S. With George Floyd's murder changed the way you think about your role as a CHRO?
Yeah, I mean, this is clearly important to me, and probably something we could all talk about for a much longer period of time, and I'll try to be brief here. And I will say this, that in the process of going through it, we received more kind of support and connectivity and contact from our global folks who were not in the U.S. And so while we make this a U.S. issue, and it's a pretty big one for the U.S., I think it has global implications, because the way you treat people is universal. And I'd also say that, we talk about racism. I live by the fundamental premise that people aren't fundamentally racist, right? But I do think sometimes their behaviors contribute to racist outcomes unbeknowingly to them. And, you know, the way I think about it is, you know, diversity is a fact and inclusion is a choice. And if you're going to make a choice to be inclusive, one of the things I tell people is that when you don't intentionally include people, you unintentionally exclude them. And so it's very, very important to be inclusive. And you know, if I gave a quick framework, because I know we're limited on time, I would say it this way. Start with humility, because humility opens up your heart and your ears. And then be curious. We've got to talk about these things. How do we let curiosity say, hey, tell me how you really feel and think? What are you curious about? And don't worry about if it's going to offend me or not. So we can open up the dialogue and really have a conversation. And then be empathetic to what you hear on both sides. You know, what you've got to learn is it's challenging for a person on the other side, because I am diverse, but you know, they have things they've dealt with and things they've heard, and they grew up a certain way. And then I think have a sense of urgency around going to do something about what you hear, so that you can make the necessary change. Because the thing I really want people to understand is sometimes we overestimate what we know and our beliefs, and we underestimate the value of what we would learn if we were to give those beliefs up. And it's amazing, I think, the transformation that happens for people when you really take the time to kind of act on what you hear, you know, listen with humility and be empathetic about it. And, you know, it doesn't, I've lived in Japan, I've lived in Europe, everywhere I've ever lived, everyone in the end wants to just feel like they have the same and equal shot to do everything that we all want to do in the world. And I think that's what, you know, what we got to get to in this country, particularly in the US, but we've got to apply globally. And it's a sad place to get to based on what we had to experience to get here. And then the last point I'll make, Brad, on your question is, it's important for us to show outcomes. You know, people race to put money in a place, and they had great statements, and I love all that, and I think that's needed. But if 12 to 18 months from now, we're not in a different place, we don't see tangible results, then we've not really used all of those important resources in the proper way. And so for me, it's all about outcomes and how we look as a global society, you know, 12 to 18 months from now.
That's great. Thank you, everyone, for the perspectives here. It's been really insightful. And for those of you joining, I hope it's been helpful to the group as well. You know, ultimately, our intention is to really, you know, we enjoy being together as a group of HR leaders, and then also invest in the community more broadly for those of you who, you know, the first CHRO is ahead of you, or for those of you who are going to jump into your third CHRO role. So thank you, Trui, Ernest, Kathryn, Tina, Erik, for your willingness to share insights on this call, in the paper that we published recently. And with that, thank you, and we'll head into our weekends.